They had studied her schedule for 3 weeks. They knew which door she used, which driver picked her up, and exactly how long the security gap lasted between the studio exit and the car. They had planned everything. What they hadn't planned for was the quiet man standing across the street. He looked like nobody. Worn work boots, a contractor's jacket, paper coffee cup going cold in his hand. He was just a father waiting for his daughter to finish class. But the moment he saw that fake badge, something behind his eyes shifted, and everything those men had planned began falling apart. This story already has your heart racing. You're exactly who this channel was made for. Hit that subscribe button right now, turn on notifications, and follow this story all the way to the end. And drop a comment telling me your city and country. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The art studio on Callaway Street occupied the ground floor of a converted brick building that had once been a textile warehouse, back when Belhaven, Colorado still had textile warehouses. The building kept its old bones exposed beams, high ceilings with original wooden rafters, tall windows that let in more light than warmth. Parents, who waited for their children outside in November, learned quickly to bring an extra layer. Grant Maddox hadn't brought one. He stood on the sidewalk across the street with his hands shoved into the pockets of his work jacket, shifting his, occasionally, to keep the cold from settling into his knees. 37 years old, and his knees already talked to him like an old man's knees. He'd been meaning to see somebody about that for about 2 years. He hadn't gotten around to it. The paper cup of gas station coffee in his hand had gone cold 20 minutes ago. He drank from it anyway. He was watching the studio door, not because anything was happening, but because that was simply how Grant Maddox was built. He watched things. Doors, windows, the way people moved on a sidewalk, who fit and who didn't. Most of the time it was just noise his brain produced without any real reason. An occupational habit that had outlasted the occupation itself by almost a decade. Piper's class let out at 4:15. It was 4:02. He had 13 minutes of standing in the cold with bad coffee, watching a street that had no reason to interest him. Except something on that street was beginning to interest him. He noticed the black SUV first because it was parked in a loading zone with its engine running, which wasn't unusual by itself. He noticed it a second time because it had been sitting in that same spot when he arrived 25 minutes earlier and hadn't moved. Not unusual either, necessarily. People sat in cars. People waited. What made him look a third time was the man standing near the studio's side entrance. The man wore a gray jacket with a small logo on the chest. From across the street, Grant couldn't read the logo, but the jacket had the cut and color of a private car service, the kind that wealthy families used. The man held a small tablet, which was also consistent with a car service. He was doing everything right. Grant watched him anyway. He watched the way the man's eyes moved, not down at the tablet the way someone actually reading from a tablet moves their eyes. The man's gaze kept sweeping left and right, short controlled sweeps, and twice he looked directly at the main entrance of the studio without any pretense of checking the tablet at all. He wasn't reading anything. He was watching the door. Grant's coffee cup lowered slowly from his mouth. Could be nothing. He knew that was probably true. Most things were nothing. Most people who looked slightly wrong on a sidewalk were just people having an off day, running late, distracted by something happening in their own heads. Grant had learned years ago not to act on the first signal. You acted on patterns. Then the second man appeared from around the corner of the building. This one wore a similar gray jacket. He moved to a position roughly 15 feet from the first man, just inside the edge of the parking area that ran along the studio's side street. He wasn't looking at a tablet. He was looking at his phone. But his thumb wasn't moving. 2 men, same jackets. Coordinated positions. One watching the entrance, one covering the approach from the parking area. Grant set the cold coffee down on the top of a metal newspaper box and didn't pick it up again. He wasn't alarmed yet. He was simply paying attention with his entire body now, the way he used to pay attention when attention was the difference between coming home and not. The studio door opened. A handful of children came out in a loose, chattering group, parents moving forward from various points along the sidewalk and parking area to collect them. Normal Tuesday afternoon energy backpacks and paint-stained smocks, and kids talking too loud about whatever small triumph or disaster had occupied the last 2 hours. Grant saw Piper's dark hair through the glass panel of the door a moment before it opened again, and she came out, already talking to the girl beside her, already in the middle of some story she was telling with her hands. He felt the small warm thing in his chest that he always felt when he saw her after even a few hours. He never mentioned it to anybody. It was just there. But his feet didn't move toward her yet, because the two men in gray jackets had both shifted. And they weren't shifting toward any of the children coming out. They were angled toward one specific child, a girl who had come out in a cluster with three others, but who now stood slightly separate from them, pausing to adjust the strap of a canvas bag on her shoulder. She was around 10, maybe 11, dark hair, good clothes, the kind of shoes that weren't chosen off a clearance rack. She was looking toward the curb, probably expecting a car. The man with the tablet raised it and spoke into it, low, and the second man's posture changed. Grant's hand was already reaching for his phone. Then the SUV's engine revved, just slightly, and it began rolling forward from the loading zone toward the side entrance. There it is. Grant made two decisions in approximately the same second. The first was that Piper did not leave that doorway. The second was that the girl with the canvas bag did not get into that vehicle. He was already moving across the street before he'd consciously finished making either decision. His path took him toward the studio entrance, not toward the men, and he covered it at a pace that was quick but not running not yet. Running on a sidewalk changes everything. Running brings eyes, and he didn't want their eyes on him until he had Piper back inside. He reached the door as she was stepping away from it. He took her by the shoulders firmly, not rough, and turned her back toward the entrance. "Dad, what inside? Right now." His voice was flat and certain, and she heard something in it she didn't usually hear because she went. She went without arguing, and that told him something about his daughter that he tucked away to be grateful for later. He pulled the door open, got Piper through it, and swept his eyes across the group of 4 or 5 children still in the entry area, along with 2 mothers who had come in from the street. "Everybody listen," he said, not shouting, just a voice that expects to be obeyed. "I need everyone back inside the building right now. Don't come out until police are here. Someone at the desk needs to call 911 immediately." One of the mothers started to ask a question. "Now, please." He was already looking back through the glass panel at the street. The young woman at the front desk was already reaching for the phone. One of the mothers gathered the remaining children without asking any further questions, which Grant was grateful for. People generally did the right thing when someone with a steady voice told them clearly what the right thing was. He went back out. The situation on the side street had moved faster than he'd wanted. The 2 men had approached the girl. The tablet was gone. It had been a prop from the start. The man who'd been holding it now had one hand on the girl's shoulder, angled so that a passing driver would see a driver's assistant helping a child toward a car, not a man gripping a child who didn't want to move. But she didn't want to move. She was planted, heels digging into the sidewalk, and she was saying something Grant couldn't hear it from here, and the man's grip on her shoulder tightened. The SUV had pulled into the side street and its rear door was open. Grant crossed the remaining distance fast. He didn't have a plan the way people in movies have plans fully formed, with contingencies. What he had was a read of the geometry and the people in it. 2 men, 1 vehicle with a driver. The men were focused on the girl and on getting her moving. The driver was watching the street behind the vehicle. The building wall on one side of the side street and a parked delivery truck on the other created a natural channel. Nobody in the main street had clear sight lines into the channel from where they stood. That meant nobody was watching Grant approach. He came in from behind the first man's right shoulder, the side he wasn't watching, and did something that looked, from any distance, almost like a greeting. Put one hand on the man's wrist, where it gripped the girl's shoulder, and he did something specific to the wrist that the man wasn't going to like. The man's grip released entirely, and he turned with a sound that was almost a word. Grant didn't wait for whatever that word was going to be. He stepped between the man and the girl. "Go," he said to her. "Building's right there. Front door. Run." She was 10 years old, and she had been terrified for the last 60 seconds, and she did not hesitate. She ran. The second man came at Grant from the left side. This was expected. Grant moved into it rather than away from it, taking the angle away, And what happened next was very brief and not elegant. It was a struggle between two people in a narrow street, not a choreographed sequence. Grant took a hit on his left side that he would feel for the next week. He gave back something that put the second man against the wall of the building with enough force to make him stay there for a moment. The first man was regaining himself. Grant assessed the driver still in the vehicle, watching the street, had not come out. 3-on-1 was a different problem than 2-on-1. Grant didn't give it a chance to become 3-on-1. He moved back toward the mouth of the side street, keeping himself between the men and the direction the girl had run, and as he moved, he raised at his phone. He'd had it in his hand the whole time, and he spoke into it clearly. Police are already on the phone. Multiple witnesses in the building behind me. Your car's plate has already been reported. None of this was precisely true, but the men didn't know that, and the fraction of a second it cost them to assess the claim was what Grant needed. The first man said something sharp to the driver. The SUV door slammed. The vehicle pulled out of the side street at a speed that was aggressive without being quite reckless, and turned left onto Callaway, and within 10 seconds it was gone. Grant stood in the side street for a moment with his left side aching and his pulse doing what it was going to do, and then he walked toward the studio entrance. The girl was standing just inside the glass door. Not crying, exactly, but close to it, the controlled face of a child who has decided not to cry and isn't completely succeeding. She had the canvas bag clutched against her chest with both arms. A woman at the desk was on the phone with what Grant could tell was 911, explaining something in a rapid, compressed voice. Piper was standing near the back wall with the other children, and she was watching Grant with a look he had never quite seen on her face before. Not exactly scared. Not exactly not scared. He pushed inside. "You're okay," he said to the girl. Not a question. Just saying it out loud in case it helped. "They're gone." The girl looked at him. She was collecting herself, he could see it happening, and she said in a voice that was steadier than he expected, "My mom is going to be really upset." "She's going to be relieved," Grant said. "You don't know my mom." Grant almost smiled, despite himself. He crouched down so he was at her level. "What's your name?" "Maya." "Okay, Maya, my name's Grant. You did everything right out there. You didn't go with them, and you made it hard for them to move you. That matters." Maya looked at him for a moment. "Who are you?" "I was waiting for my daughter." He gestured toward Piper, who had crossed the room and was now standing right behind Grant with her hand on his shoulder. The way she did sometimes when she was uncertain about something but didn't want anyone to know. Maya's eyes moved to Piper and then back to Grant. "Are you a police officer?" "No." He moved like one. Grant didn't answer that. He straightened up and looked at the woman at the desk. "How long for police?" "They said 4 minutes. It was closer to 7. During those 7 minutes, Grant answered questions from the desk attendant, checked Pipe for any sign that the afternoon had damaged her in ways that wouldn't be immediately visible, and stood near the door, watching the street. Maya sat in a chair near the front desk and accepted a cup of water that someone brought her and held it without drinking it. When the police cruiser pulled up, 2 more cars arrived almost simultaneously. One was an unmarked sedan with a detective's grille light. The other was a dark gray car that had clearly been driving at a speed not entirely consistent with traffic laws and stopped with a quick, controlled finality that suggested the driver was accustomed to stopping fast. A woman got out of the gray car before it had fully stopped rocking. She was 30, maybe, dressed in a tailored gray blazer over dark pants, the kind of clothes that signaled she had gone directly from somewhere professional to here without stopping. Her hair was dark and loosely pulled back in a way that suggested it had started the day more put together. She was moving toward the studio entrance with the kind of walk that parted crowds without meaning to not aggressive, just completely certain of where it was going. She pushed through the front door. Her eyes went to Maya, and everything else in the room ceased to exist. Baby. She crossed to her daughter in 4 steps and got down on her knees on the tile floor right there in front of the desk, not caring at all that it was a public space, and she pulled Maya into her arms and held her. Maya held on hard. Grant watched. He had moved back a step to give them space. After a long moment, the woman pulled back enough to look at Maya's face, checking her the way parents checked eyes, expression, the specific quality of the breathing, and she said, "Are you hurt?" "Anywhere." "No." You're sure, Mom? I'm sure. The woman took a breath and held it for a moment. Then she stood up. She was still holding Maya's hand. Her eyes found Grant. She had the eyes of someone who had learned early not to trust quickly. Not hostile, just careful. She looked at him, the way people looked at something they were trying to accurately assess. Was it you, she said, not pointing or gesturing. Just asking. I was across the street, Grant said. I noticed something was off before they approached her. What made you do anything about it? It wasn't a hostile question. It was a real one. Grant recognized the difference. I'm a father, he said. It seemed like the obvious thing. She studied him for another moment. What's your name? Grant Maddox. Celeste Arden. She didn't offer her hand. She was still holding Maya's, Mr. Maddox. I'm going to need to understand exactly what you saw. A detective had appeared at Grant's elbow, a tall man in his 40s with a notepad already open. Grant recognized the moment when a situation stops being physical and becomes procedural. I can walk through it, Grant said. All of it. Good. Celeste hadn't looked away from him. Because I don't think this was random. And I think you saw something that tells us why. She wasn't asking. She was already 4 steps ahead in her own thinking, and she was wanting him to see whether he had gotten there too. He had. He just hadn't said it yet. Because what Grant had seen, in the last seconds before the SUV pulled away, was something that changed the nature of everything that had just happened. One of the men had not looked at Maya in those final moments. He had looked at the building's side entrance, the one that served as the secondary access point for Celeste's household staff. He had looked at it like he already knew it was there. And he had looked at it like someone had told him exactly where to find it. The detective's name was Harlan Briggs, and he had the kind of face that had stopped being surprised by things a long time ago. He was 51, thick through the shoulders, with close-cropped gray hair and reading glasses. He kept pushing up his nose even when he wasn't reading anything. He had worked violent crimes in Bellhaven for 19 years, which meant he had seen enough to stay calm and enough to know when calm was the right response and when it wasn't. He wasn't entirely calm right now. He stood in the studio's small back office the manager had offered it so the adults could talk without the children hearing. With his notepad open and his pen moving, and he listened to Grant Maddox describe what he had seen with the focused attention of a man who recognized a competent witness when he was sitting across from one. Celeste sat in the only other chair in the room. Maya was outside with a female officer and Piper, the 3 of them in the main studio space where the children's unfinished paintings still sat on the easels. Nobody had suggested clearing them away. Grant stood because there wasn't another chair and he hadn't asked for one. Walk me through the badge again, Briggs said. The first man had it clipped to the front pocket of his jacket. Standard placement for a car service ID, but it was angled wrong facing out instead of toward his body. Real drivers don't think about their badges. They forget they're wearing them. This one was positioned to be seen, meaning it was a prop. Meaning whoever set this up knew that a legitimate-looking badge would reduce the chance of anyone intervening. They were right about that. Nobody else on that street gave them a second look. Briggs wrote something. But you did. I had time and I had nothing else to look at, Grant said. Most people don't. They're on their phones or they're thinking about something else. I happened to be standing still with nothing in my hands. Celeste had been listening without speaking since they sat down. Now, she said, you said something before, about the side entrance. Briggs glanced at her, then at Grant. Grant nodded. When the SUV was pulling out, one of the men, the first one, the one with the badge, he looked at the secondary entrance on the south side of the building. The one that's not visible from the main street. That's the staff entrance, Celeste said. Her voice had gone quieter, not softer. Only my household staff and my security team know about it. It's not on any public map. It's not in any press coverage. I have it specifically kept off any documentation that leaves my office. The room was quiet for a moment. Briggs stopped writing. You're telling me he looked at an entrance he shouldn't have known existed. He looked at it like he'd been told about it, Grant said. Not like he was discovering it. Like he was confirming it matched the description he'd been given. Celeste stood up. It wasn't an agitated movement, it was controlled, but it was the movement of someone whose body had decided it was done sitting still. She went to the small window that overlooked the alley behind the building and stood with her back to both men for a moment. So someone told them, she said. That's one explanation, Briggs said carefully. What's the other one? Briggs didn't answer immediately, and his silence was itself an answer. There isn't another one, Grant said. Not unkindly. Just accurately. Celeste didn't turn around. How many people know about that entrance? 12. Maybe 14. My head of security, his team, my house manager, 2 drivers. She paused. My assistant. We'll need all of those names, Briggs said. You'll have them in an hour. She finally turned back from the window. She looked at Grant directly. How did you know to look for that? Most people who had done what you did out there would have been watching the men, not watching where the men were looking. Grant considered the question seriously, the way he considered most things, without hurrying toward an answer, just because one was expected. Force of habit, he said. When you're trying to understand a situation, the people in front of you are usually the least interesting part. It's where they came from, and what they know that tells you more. Celeste held his gaze for a moment. What did you do before construction? Navy. She waited. He didn't add anything. Briggs cleared his throat and redirected. Mr. Maddox, I'm going to need you available for follow-up. Can you stay in town for the next few days? I live here, Grant said. Right. Briggs made a note that was probably just him writing the word local. We're going to pull the traffic cameras on Callaway and the 2 side streets. If that SUV came in from the north, there's a camera at the Reeves intersection that should have caught the plate. They came from the north, Grant said. I heard the engine before I saw the vehicle. It came from the direction of the parking structure on Reeves. Briggs looked up. You're sure? Sound carries differently depending on the buildings around it. That block has a gap on the north side where the old Marcus building came down. Engine sound would funnel through it. Yes, I'm sure. Briggs wrote for several seconds without saying anything. Then, okay. We're done here for now. Ms. Arden, I'll need those names as soon as possible. And I'd recommend increasing whatever security protocols you currently have in place until we understand what we're dealing with. Already done, Celeste said. I made 2 calls from the car on the way here. Briggs nodded, pocketed his notepad, and left. The room felt different with just the 2 of them in it. Not uncomfortable, exactly. Just different. Grant picked up his jacket from the back of the chair where he'd draped it when they sat down. One more thing, Celeste said. He stopped. The man you put against the wall. Is he going to need medical attention? Grant thought about it honestly. Probably a bruised shoulder. Maybe a bruised ego. He'll be fine. Something moved across Celeste's face that wasn't quite a smile. I want to compensate you for what you did today. I didn't do it for compensation. I understand that. I'm not suggesting you did. I'm saying that my daughter is sitting out there right now, instead of in the back of an SUV being driven somewhere I can't find her, and that is because of what you chose to do. I want to... No, Grant said. Thank you, but no. Celeste looked at him the way she'd looked at him outside. Assessing, trying to locate the angle. Most people don't say no to me. I'm not trying to be difficult. I just don't want anything. He said it without any performance. It was simply true, and it didn't need explaining. She studied him for another moment, then nodded once. All right. He went to the door, Mr. Maddox. Her voice was quieter now. Less the corporate voice, more the actual one underneath it. Thank you. For not walking past. Grant nodded. He opened the door and went back into the main studio where Piper was sitting beside Maya. The 2 of them apparently deep in a conversation about something he caught the word octopus and decided he didn't need the context. Piper looked up when he appeared. Are we going home? She asked. In a minute. He crouched beside her the way he had crouched beside Maya earlier. You doing okay? I'm okay. She said it the way 8-year-olds said things quickly, because the question interrupted the more important octopus conversation. But then she looked at him more carefully and added, Are you okay? Yeah, bug. I'm fine. She scrutinized his face with the specific skepticism of a child who had been lied to for her own good on a previous occasion and wasn't prepared to let it slide twice. Your jacket has a mark on it. I know. What happened to it? I leaned against something. Piper decided to accept this, though her expression suggested she was filing it under revisit later. She turned back to Maya, who was watching this exchange with the same quiet attention she'd shown since the officer arrived. My dad leans against a lot of things, Piper said to Maya, with the gravity of an expert witness presenting established facts. Maya glanced at Grant. "I noticed," she said. Grant stood back up. The female officer, a young woman named Torres, who had been patient and steady throughout, caught his eye and gave him a small nod that communicated several things at once. "The kids are fine. You did the right thing. We've got it from here." He nodded back. Celeste came out of the office a minute later. Stopped when she saw Maya and Piper side by side, still talking. Maya's canvas bag finally set down beside her feet, instead of clutched to her chest. Something shifted in Celeste's expression, a loosening, just briefly, of whatever she kept pulled tight across herself in public. Crossed to Maya and put a hand on her daughter's shoulder, light and steady. "We're going to head out in a few minutes," she said. "Say goodbye." Maya looked at Piper. "Do you have a phone?" "I have an iPad," Piper said, which was apparently close enough, because Maya asked her mother for her own phone, and the two girls exchanged contact information with the practiced efficiency of children who had been managing their own social logistics since they were 6. Grant watched this and thought about how much simpler everything seemed at 8 and 10, before you understood that the world could move against you and that the people closest to you were sometimes the ones who opened the door to let it in. He thought about that second man and the specific direction of his gaze. He thought about it for the rest of the evening. The police interview the following morning lasted 2 hours. Briggs brought a second detective, a younger woman named Reyes, who said very little and wrote everything down, and they went through the events again in the kind of granular detail that Grant was comfortable with and that most civilians found exhausting. He didn't find it exhausting. Detail was the job, or had been, and he still approached it that way, even if the job was now load-bearing walls and contractor bids instead of mission parameters. The traffic camera on Reeves had caught the SUV. Partial plate enough to run. The vehicle had been reported stolen 2 days earlier from a long-term parking lot at Denver International Airport. The men had planned that detail too. What the camera had also caught, in the frame just before the SUV turned onto the side street, was a second vehicle. Plain white sedan, sitting in a metered spot on Reeves with its engine running. It had pulled away at almost exactly the same moment the SUV left the side street. "Lookout car," Grant said when Briggs showed him the still frame. "That's what we think, which means at minimum 3 people involved in the operation. Driver of the SUV, the 2 men, and whoever was in the sedan monitoring the street. 4 people minimum," Grant said. "You don't run an operation like this without someone on comms who isn't physically present. Someone who can abort if circumstances change." Reyes looked up from her notepad. Briggs leaned back in his chair. "You want to tell me what branch?" "SEALs," Grant said. Briggs processed this without much visible reaction, which Grant respected. "How long out?" 8 years. And now you pour concrete. Frame houses, mostly. Some commercial work." Briggs looked at him for a moment. "Okay. So 4 people minimum. The organization behind this has resources. This wasn't improvised." "No, 3 weeks of surveillance minimum." "Probably longer." They knew the schedule, the vehicle, the entrance, security rotation. Grant paused. "Security rotation." Briggs caught it. "Say more." "Celeste Arden runs professional security. Her driver would have protocol set intervals, variable routes, check-in times. If you knew the security rotation, you knew the window. The window yesterday was 8 minutes, roughly, between when Maya exited the studio and when the backup security vehicle was scheduled to arrive at that location." He looked at Briggs steadily. "I was there for 25 minutes before they made their move. They waited for the window. And you knew about the window how?" "I counted the cars on the street. Her primary driver arrived at 3:49. He had a specific parking position center of the main lot, exit angle toward the north route. Professional placement, but he was alone. No secondary vehicle. In a normal security setup for a principal of her profile, there'd be a second vehicle for school pickups, especially after she moved into the public spotlight this past year." Grant shook his head slightly. "I didn't know about the window. I noticed the gap. They knew about the window. Someone told them exactly when it opened and exactly how long it lasted." Reyes had stopped writing and was just watching him. Briggs tapped his pen against the table once. "Ms. Arden is going to want to hear this." "She's already thinking it," Grant said. She's probably been thinking it since last night. He was right. Celeste called him at 7:15 that evening. He was in the kitchen, trying to get Piper to eat something that wasn't from a box, losing that particular argument by degrees. "Detective Briggs told me what you said this morning," she said without preamble. "About the window. He didn't tell me details. He said your read of the situation pointed toward an inside source, and that your read was detailed enough that he wasn't dismissing it." A pause. "I'm not calling to thank you again. I'm calling because you're right, and I need to think through it with someone who isn't directly employed by me." Grant looked at Piper, who had abandoned the broccoli entirely and was now feeding it in small pieces to the dog under the table, one piece at a time, with the kind of covert precision that suggested she'd been doing this for a while. "Piper," he said it without inflection. She withdrew her hand from under the table. Dog made a small, disappointed sound. "Give me 10 minutes, Grant said into the phone. He got Piper squared away. With her actual dinner, she ate the broccoli when he sat down across from her and just waited, which was usually sufficient, and then took his phone out to the back porch, where the cold was sharp and clean, and the neighbor's security light gave enough illumination to see by. "Walk me through who had access," he said. Celeste didn't hesitate. She had been doing exactly that, clearly, for the past 24 hours. Her security director, a man named Voss, who had been with her organization for 6 years, managed the rotation schedules and was the only person outside her own household who had complete access to Maya's daily calendar. Below him, 3 senior security staff had partial access. Her house manager, a woman named Ruth, who had been with her family for 9 years, coordinated school pickups and communicated directly with drivers. Her personal assistant had calendar access but no security system access. "Ruth is not a consideration," Celeste said. "I won't go down that road." "You might need to." "I know Ruth." "You knew all of them," Grant said. "That's sort of the problem." Silence. "I'm not saying it's Ruth," he added. "I'm saying you can't start the list with someone you've already crossed off." More silence. "Then you're not very diplomatic." "No." "Is that a SEAL thing or a you thing?" "Probably both." He leaned against the porch railing. The wood was cold through his jacket. Who's had financial stress recently? Lifestyle change. New expenses that don't match their salary. Anything that would create pressure. "I don't monitor my employees' personal finances." "You should have someone who does. Not intrusively. Just baseline awareness. It's standard risk management for someone in your position." Voss was supposed to handle that. Grant let that sit between them for a moment. "Right," Celeste said quietly. "It doesn't mean it was him. But he's the one person in your security organization who would have access to every variable the people in that SUV seemed to know." He heard her exhale slowly on the other end of the line. Not the sharp exhale of someone losing composure more, the exhale of someone who had been holding their breath for a day and was finally, carefully, letting some of it out. "If it was Voss," she said, "he's been with me for 6 years. He's been in my house. He's eaten dinner at my table. He knows Maya's middle name." A pause. "He taught her how to play chess last Christmas." Grant didn't say anything. "I know that's not relevant to whether he did it," she said. "No, but it's relevant to how you feel about it. That matters too." Another pause longer. "You're not what I expected," she said. "What did you expect?" "I don't know. Someone who wanted something. Everyone who inserts themselves into my life wants something." She said it without self-pity. Just as a fact she had accumulated across years. Compensation. A job, visibility. Something. "I wanted to stop 2 men from putting a kid in an SUV," Grant said. "That was it. I'm not trying to become part of your world." "I know," she said. "That's the part that's confusing me." He wasn't sure what to do with that, so he didn't try to do anything with it. "Talk to Briggs. Tell him to look at Voss's finances. If there's something there, they'll find it. If there isn't, you'll know. And in the meantime, don't change your security setup in any way that Voss would notice. If he's the one and he suspects you're onto him, he'll take steps." What kind of steps? Grant considered how honest to be. Either disappear or make sure that whoever hired him knows the plan is compromised. Either way, you lose the trail. The night was very quiet around him. Dog somewhere down the street. A car passing on the main road 2 blocks over. "All right," Celeste said. "I'll call Briggs tonight." "Good, Mr. Maddox Grant," he said. because they had been talking for 20 minutes, and the formalities seemed beside the point by now. A brief pause. Grant, what are you doing tomorrow morning? Site meeting at 7, done by 9. Would you be willing to walk through my current security setup with me? I'll send a car. I can drive myself. I know you can, she said. And this time, there was something almost dry in it. Almost wry. Almost the tone of someone who had a sense of humor buried somewhere under all the armor. I was trying to be polite. I appreciate it. I'll drive myself. Pause. 9:30. He went back inside. Piper had finished her dinner and was on the couch with the dog, who had apparently been forgiven for failing to eat the full broccoli quota. She looked up when Grant came in. Who were you talking to? Maya's mom. Piper absorbed this with the neutral expression she used when something interested her, but she wasn't ready to show it yet. Is Maya okay? She's okay. Is her mom nice? Grant thought about the question. He thought about the woman who had gotten out of a car that was still rocking and gone to her knees on a tile floor without caring who saw it. He thought about the same woman who had spent the last 24 hours dissecting her own circle of trust with the cold precision of someone who had learned to protect herself by expecting the worst. She's complicated, he said. Piper nodded as if this confirmed something she'd already suspected.
Like you,
she said. Grant looked at her. She was already looking back at the television. He sat down in the armchair across from the couch and thought about the side entrance, and the man's eyes, and the specific quality of knowledge that had been in that glance, not discovery, not curiosity. Recognition, the look of someone seeing a thing they had been described. 12 people knew about that entrance, maybe 14. One of them had made a decision that had put a 10-year-old in the grip of a stranger on a side street. Grant thought about Maya's face when she'd said, "You don't know my mom." The steadiness of it, even shaken, even frightened. Particular toughness of children who have grown up with one parent working too hard and have learned to carry more than they should. He thought about Piper feeding broccoli to the dog under the table and knew that look from the inside. He thought about whoever had sold that information and the careful, patient work of following money until it told the truth. And he thought that Briggs was a competent detective, but that competent detectives worked within certain procedural limits that the people behind the SUV almost certainly understood very well. The fire in the small wood stove he'd built into the wall of the living room had burned down to coals. He got up to add a log. The dog moved its tail once without opening its eyes. Tomorrow at 9:30, he would drive to a billionaire's house and walk through a security setup that had already been compromised once from the inside. He would do it because it needed doing, and because he happened to be the person in the best position to do it. Not because he wanted anything from it. That had always been the thing about Grant Maddox that people who tried to understand him eventually had to just accept. He didn't want much. He wanted Piper to eat her vegetables. He wanted his knees to stop complaining in cold weather. He wanted to do work that was honest and come home at a reasonable hour and sit by a fire that he'd built himself. He had learned in another life that the world was full of people who wanted enormous things: power, control, money enough to reshape the circumstances of others, and that those enormous wants had a way of becoming dangerous. The people behind the SUV wanted something enormous. Grant just wanted to make sure they didn't get it. That was usually enough of a reason. Celeste Arden's property sat 12 miles outside Belhaven proper, at the end of a private road that wound through 3/4 of a mile of pine forest before opening onto a cleared ridge with views of the San Juan range to the south. The house itself was large without being excessive stone tune and timber, 3 stories, built into the hillside so that the top floor was level with the road and the lower floors dropped away behind it. It looked like something designed by someone who actually wanted to live in it rather than impress people driving past. Grant pulled his truck onto the gravel turnout at 9:28 and sat for a moment with the engine off, looking at the security setup the way he always looked at a new site, taking in the whole thing before focusing on the parts. 2 cameras visible on the main gate pillar, another on the fence line 40 yards east. A guard booth at the gate, currently staffed by a man who had come out to the window before Grant's truck was fully stopped. The road approach was clear for 300 yards, good sight lines, no natural concealment for a vehicle trying to approach quietly. The fence line ran into the tree line on both sides and was topped with what looked like sensor wire rather than razor wire, which was the more expensive choice and the smarter one. Whoever had designed the outer perimeter knew what they were doing. Gate guard checked Grant's ID with the thoroughness of someone who had been told to be thorough and had taken the instructions seriously. He was young, maybe 25, and he had the posture of someone with prior military or law enforcement, not stiff, just organized. He called in the confirmation, got it, and waved Grant through without unnecessary conversation. The driveway curved up to a motor court in front of the main entrance. Celeste was already outside when Grant pulled in, which he noticed because most people in her position would have sent someone to receive a guest and appeared themselves only after the guest was inside. She was in a dark green jacket and boots with a mug of something hot, and she was looking at the tree line to the east with the distracted expression of someone who had been thinking hard about something and hadn't quite stopped when she heard the truck coming. She looked at Grant as he got out. "You're on time." I said 9:30. Most people say 9:30 and mean 9:40. "I'm not most people," he said, not as a boast, just as a fact, and she seemed to take it that way. She handed him the mug. It was coffee black, still hot. He took it without asking questions. "I made a call last night," she said, starting toward the east side of the property without any preamble, clearly expecting him to walk with her. He did. "To a private investigator I trust, former FBI. She's been running a parallel financial check on Voss for the past 12 hours.
Briggs know about this?
Briggs knows I'm cooperating fully with the investigation." She said it in a way that didn't answer the question, and she knew he noticed, and she didn't seem particularly concerned about that. They walked along the fence line toward the eastern corner of the property. The ground was hard with frost, and the grass crunched faintly underfoot. Grant sipped the coffee and looked at the camera placements and the sensor wire and the sight angles between coverage zones. "There's a gap," he said. "Where?" "Right here." He stopped at a point where the fence line curved to follow the natural contour of the ridge. Camera on the main fence covers to this curve. The camera on the south corner covers from the tree line to roughly 20 yards past the curve. But there's a 12 to 15 second window in the overlap zone where the angle of the south camera is blocked by the ridge contour. Someone who knew about it could be at the fence for 15 seconds without being on any recording. Celeste looked at the fence, then at the camera on the south corner. Voss designed this layout, I figured. He told me it was fully redundant. It mostly is. That gap is small enough that it could be an honest design oversight. Grant paused. Or it could be intentional. If you wanted a way to pass something out or let someone in without it being recorded, that's your spot. Celeste was quiet. She looked at the gap in coverage for a long moment with the expression of someone revising something they thought they understood. "My PI called me at 6 this morning," she said finally. "Voss has a second account. Personal savings registered at a bank in Pueblo. 2 months ago, it received a transfer of $42,000 from a shell company registered in Nevada. The shell has 3 layers above it. She's still pulling the thread." She paused. "He also has a significant outstanding debt to an unlicensed lender. The kind that charges rates a bank wouldn't and collects in ways a bank couldn't." Grant looked at her. "When did the debt start?" She traced the original loan to 14 months ago. Celeste met his eyes. He needed $60,000 fast. His brother ran up gambling losses in Las Vegas, and Voss co-signed the loan. The lender is connected to an organized crime group out of Phoenix, and he's been paying them back until he couldn't. She turned back toward the house. The $42,000 into the Pueblo account is too close to the timing of the attempted abduction. My PI thinks it's a partial advance on what he was promised." Grant walked beside her in silence for a moment. The mountain air was cold and clean, and the trees to the east were beginning to catch the late morning light. "Have you spoken to him since yesterday?" he asked. "Yesterday afternoon, briefly. He came in, asked how Maya was, reported that he'd increased the gate coverage and added a third driver to the rotation. Very professional. Very concerned." She said the last 2 words with a flatness that meant the opposite of what the words said. "I acted normal. Or I tried to. Did he seem like he thought anything was off?" "He seemed like a man who does not believe anyone is looking at him." She said it carefully, Precisely. Which is either because he's innocent or because he's been very careful. Those two things look different, Grant said. Innocent people act normal because they have nothing to track. Careful people act normal by working at it. There's usually a tell something too controlled, too consistent, a detail that fits too well. He glanced at her. Was there anything like that? She walked for a few steps before answering. He asked if the police had any leads on the SUV. Just once, very casually, as part of a longer update. The phrasing was specific. He asked if they'd found where it came from. Not who drove it. She paused. I didn't think about it until I was falling asleep. The natural question is who. If you're genuinely worried about the origin of a threat against someone you protect, you want to know who's behind it. You ask about who. Unless you already know who, Grant said. Unless you already know. They had come back around toward the front of the house. The guard at the gate was visible in the distance, back inside the booth. The motor court was quiet in the cold. Grant handed back the empty mug. You need to call Briggs today. Everything your PI found goes to him. The account, the shell company, the lender. All of it. I know. And you need to do it without Voss knowing the investigation has turned. If he finds out, he'll run or he'll call the people who hired him. You said. She looked at him steadily. I'm not slow, Grant. I know you're not. I'm just being thorough. Is that a SEAL thing or a you thing? He recognized it as his own question from the night before turned back on him. He almost smiled. Both, probably. She did smile then, briefly, not quite reaching her eyes. Come inside. I want to show you the interior layout. The inside of the house was warmer than Grant expected, not in temperature but in character. He'd anticipated the kind of large, wealthy home that looked like a showroom, everything expensive, nothing personal. Instead, there were books on actual shelves that had been read rather than curated, a drawing by Maya on the refrigerator door that had been there long enough to show curled edges, a pair of mud boots by the back entrance that still had actual mud on them. Ruth, the house manager, was in the kitchen when they passed through. She was a sturdy woman in her late 50s with reading glasses pushed up on her head and a dish towel over one shoulder. And she looked at Grant with the frank, unhurried appraisal of someone who had spent enough years in a household to know who mattered and who was passing through. Coffee's fresh, she said to Grant. Had some. Thank you. You want breakfast? There's leftover quiche, Ruth Celeste said with the tone of someone redirecting gently. I'm offering. He's a large man, he probably eats. Ruth turned back to the counter with unruffled dignity. Something in Grant's chest did a small involuntary thing that he chose not to examine. Celeste showed him the interior camera layout, the control room off the main security office, the safe room on the second floor. The safe room was well-designed reinforced door, independent communication system, 3 days of supplies. Someone had built it properly. Voss specified this too, Celeste said. It's good work. He's good at his job. She said it with the weariness of someone who understood that these two things, being good at the job and having betrayed you, were not mutually exclusive and were in fact somehow worse in combination. Grant looked at the safe room communication panel. This has an independent line, fiber and cellular backup. The cellular is through which carrier? Celeste frowned slightly. I'd have to check. Check. If it's through a carrier that Voss specified and set up, there's a chance the backup channel is compromised too. Not certain, but possible. He turned from the panel. You and Maya should know how to use this room. Not in theory. Actually, no door sequence. Communication sequence. How long the supplies last. What the extraction protocol is. We've done the drill. When? She paused. When did you last run the drill, he said. A longer pause, 8 months ago. Run it again. This week. Without Voss. She nodded. He could see her absorbing this not defensively, just adding it to the growing list of things that needed immediate action and only one of her to do them. Maya's at school right now, she said. I know, I have 2 drivers on that route today instead of 1. Good. But make sure neither of those drivers was assigned by Voss. Celeste stopped. She looked at him. He could see the moment she realized she hadn't thought of that. I assigned them both through the normal channel, she said quietly, which goes through Voss's office. Grant kept his voice even. Call them right now. Both drivers. Get a 3rd driver to that school, Someone from outside the regular rotation, someone you trust personally. Get Maya picked up on a different route than the one logged in Voss's system. Celeste had already taken out her phone. She was dialing before he finished speaking. He listened to her handle it, calm, clear, no panic in her voice, even though he could see it in the set of her jaw, and he thought again about the question of how people held up under pressure. Some people went loud and some people went still. Celeste went very, very precise. The call took 4 minutes. When she hung up, she looked at Grant with the expression of someone who had just understood something they should have understood sooner and was not willing to spend time being embarrassed about it. Done, she said. Good, I didn't think about the drivers. You've been managing about 40 things in the last 18 hours. You can't see all of it at once. That's generous of you. It's accurate, he said, which wasn't the same thing, and she seemed to know it. Briggs called Celeste at 11:47. Grant was in the security control room reviewing camera logs when she stepped into the doorway with her phone still in her hand and her face slightly altered, not pale. Exactly. But changed in the way faces changed when something you half expected became something real. They found a burner phone in Voss's car, she said. Registered to nothing. Call history shows 12 calls over the past 6 weeks to a number that traces back to a prepaid carrier in Phoenix. Phoenix, Grant thought. Same city as the organized crime connection her PI had identified. Has Briggs brought him in? He's doing it now. Voss is at the main Bellhaven office. I have a satellite office downtown, and Briggs is there with 2 other detectives. She stopped and pressed her lips together for a moment. They're arresting him. Grant came out of the control room. She was standing in the corridor with her back against the wall and her arms crossed, not for warmth. Are you all right, he asked. I'm angry, she said. I thought I'd be more I don't know. Relieved that it wasn't Ruth, or sad that it was him, or something more organized than just angry. She looked at the wall across from her. He ate at my table. Maya was excited to show him the chess move she'd learned. She did a whole little presentation for him. She'd drawn it out on a piece of paper. She exhaled through her nose. And he sat there and said good job, and 2 weeks later he gave her schedule to criminals. Grant didn't try to find the right thing to say, because there wasn't a right thing to say about that. Just the fact of it, sitting in the corridor between them. The anger makes sense, he said. It doesn't feel useful. It doesn't have to be useful. It's just true. She looked at him. He had the sense again of her trying to locate the angle, the ask, the thing underneath the thing, and coming up empty and not quite knowing what to do with that. Briggs wants me to come in and make a statement, she said. This afternoon. That's standard. Go. She stopped. Started again. He said Voss is already talking, in exchange for a reduced charge on the conspiracy count. He's giving names. Then the people above him in this are going to know within hours that the structure has collapsed. Grant kept his voice level. Voss will tell his lawyer will try to use the information as leverage, and someone will make a call. Which means the people who originally arranged the abduction attempt know that Voss is in custody, that the financial connection has been found, and that the operation has been compromised. At that point, the calculus changes for them. Taking Maya still has a value as leverage, as collateral, as insurance against Voss saying too much. Celeste stared at him. So she's more at risk now than she was yesterday. Possibly, for a short window, until they decide to cut their losses and run. How do I know which one they'll choose? You don't, Grant said. So you act as if they'll choose the worst option, and you're wrong, then act as if they won't, and you're right. She took that in. He watched her run it through whatever internal process she's used to take difficult information and convert it into action, which was, he was learning, a very fast process. I need to get Maya, she said. Call Briggs first. Tell him what you just told me, that Voss's arrest changes the risk calculation for Maya. He'll coordinate protective custody for her today while you're at the station. And after she stays here, on property. With a security detail that you personally assembled, and that has zero connection to Voss or anyone he knew. Celeste was already dialing. She walked down the corridor toward the main room, speaking rapidly, and Grant went back into the control room and looked at the camera feeds. The exterior cameras showed the gate, the drive, the fence lines, the motor court. Everything quiet. The pine trees on the eastern ridge moved in a wind that hadn't reached the house yet. He looked at the gap in the fence coverage that Voss had designed into the system. Looked at it for a long time. The next 48 hours happened fast and slow simultaneously, the way significant hours always did. Voss gave 3 names in his initial statement to Briggs. A mid-level organizer based in Phoenix who had approached him 14 months earlier through the gambling debt connection, not randomly. Grant thought, when he heard this, but deliberately, the way predators found specific animals rather than any animal. A man named Dreyer, who had served as the operational coordinator for the abduction attempt and who had almost certainly been in the white sedan on Reeves Street. And a third name that Voss claimed he'd only heard once, in a phone call, never confirmed, which meant it was either a dead end or the most important name on the list. Briggs shared this with Celeste in a conference room at the Belhaven police station on the afternoon of the second day, with a representative from the district attorney's office present and a federal agent who had appeared without much explanation and whose presence suggested that the Phoenix connection was already known at a level above local law enforcement. Grant was not in that conference room. He had no official reason to be there, and he hadn't been invited. He was in the parking lot of the station. In his truck, with the window cracked 2 inches, doing the temperature and discomfort calculation that he had learned in the Navy was worth it when you needed to think clearly and comfortable places made you soft. Celeste had told him the meeting details because she had started, in the past 2 days, to do that share information with him, as a matter of course, the way you shared information with someone whose judgment you'd decided to rely on. Grant had noticed this and hadn't commented on it and had simply continued to be available when she needed to think something through, because that seemed to be what the situation required, and he didn't have a complicated reason for doing it. He was thinking about the third name, the one Voss claimed to have heard only once. Whoever had hired this operation had resources, not just money, but access to structured criminal networks, the patience to develop an inside source over 14 months, and the operational competence to run a coordinated 4-person abduction on an informed target. That wasn't a crime of opportunity. It wasn't even simple greed. This was someone who wanted Celeste Arden specifically to be in a position of complete vulnerability. Not just money, something more specific than money. He was still turning this over when his phone rang. The number was Celeste's. "We're done in here," she said. "Can you come up? I'm in the parking lot." A pause. "You've been in the parking lot this whole time?" "I had things to think about." Another pause, during which he imagined her deciding whether or not to comment on this. She decided not to. "Come up. There's something Briggs needs to hear from both of us." The conference room was smaller than he'd pictured from her description. Briggs sat at one end of the table with Detective Reyes and the federal agent, whose name was Cardwell, and who had the compact, unremarkable appearance of someone who had professionally cultivated being easy to forget. The DA's representative had left. Grant sat in the chair Celeste indicated. Cardwell looked at him with the assessing look of federal agents, which was different from the assessing look of local detectives, more lateral, less direct, as though evaluation happened from an angle rather than head-on. "Briggs tells me you were a SEAL," Cardwell said, "long time ago." "Team 4. Cardwell nodded slightly, which conveyed something Grant couldn't fully read. "The third name Voss gave," Celeste said. "Tell him what you told me on the phone." Grant looked at her. She had clearly already told Briggs something, because Briggs was watching Grant with the patient attention of a man waiting for confirmation of something he'd already partially heard. "I think it's someone connected to her company," Grant said. "Not an outsider who decided to target her. Someone who knows her operation well enough to understand that a ransom demand wouldn't be the most efficient form of leverage. Someone who wanted Celeste in a compromised position, a mother who just had her daughter taken and returned, because that position would make her vulnerable in a very specific way." "Vulnerable to what?" Reyes asked. Grant looked at Celeste. It was her story to tell. She was quiet for a moment. "My company is 3 months from a major patent licensing decision. There are 3 other entities competing for the same space. One of them has made 2 informal acquisition approaches to my board in the past year, both of which I declined." She paused. "If I were compromised publicly, emotionally, personally, my board has the mechanism to trigger a competency review." It's in the original corporate charter. I agreed to it because my lead investor insisted, and I needed the capital. She said the last sentence with the clipped certainty of someone who had replayed that particular decision many times in the past 2 days. A board-triggered competency review would give the acquisition party access to our pending patents as part of due diligence. It would also allow them to delay the licensing decision for up to 6 months, during which they could move their own product into the market position we currently hold. The room was quiet. Cardwell had produced a small notebook from somewhere and was writing in it with a pen that was too cheap for a federal agent. Grant thought, and then thought that was probably intentional. "You think the abduction was designed to fail," Grant said. Celeste met his eyes. The ransom demand, if it had worked, would have been secondary. Primary objective was the photograph, a billionaire's child taken from a public street. The story would have been everywhere within hours. My board would have convened within 48 hours of that. And Meridian Group, which is the acquisition entity, would have had their attorneys in contact with my lead investor before the week was out. "Meridian," Briggs said. "You're naming them. I'm naming them to you. In this room. Because I believe they're connected to the third name Voss gave you." Celeste's voice was controlled and very, very precise. "I want you to find that connection before they understand that Voss has given it up." Cardwell looked up from his notebook. "Ms. Arden, if Meridian Group is behind this, we're looking at federal conspiracy charges, wire fraud, potentially organized crime connections. This becomes a different scope of investigation. I understand that. You also understand that once this becomes federal, the timeline and the process are no longer in your control." "I understand that too." She folded her hands on the table. "I'm still naming them." Grant looked at her hands. Steady. He thought about the 12 or 14 people who had known about the side entrance. He thought about Voss sitting across from Briggs and calculating which names were worth trading and which to keep. He thought about whoever was at the top of that chain, sitting somewhere comfortable and waiting to hear how the investment had performed. "There's something else," Grant said. Everyone looked at him. "Voss knows he's in custody. His lawyer knows. The people he was working for will know soon if they don't already. And they're going to draw the same conclusion I would draw." He looked at Briggs. "The operation failed. The inside source is compromised. The financial trail exists. In that situation, the safest move is to create a distraction." "What kind of distraction?" Reyes said. "A second attempt. Not to succeed, to create chaos. To shift Celeste's attention and the investigation's attention, and to potentially put her in a position where she makes a decision under pressure that benefits them." Grant paused. "I'd expect something in the next 24 to 48 hours. Before Cardwell's people can fully develop the federal angle." Cardwell was watching him with the lateral assessment. "You're describing a feint. I'm describing what I would do if I were trying to preserve a corporate objective after the primary operation collapsed." Grant looked at Celeste. "You need to make sure Maya is somewhere they can't find her. Not the house, or not only the house. Somewhere off pattern, off schedule." "My sisters," Celeste said immediately, "in Fort Collins. They don't know about her. She's not connected to anything business-related. She's a physical therapist. She lives quietly. She's not in any documentation that connects to me professionally." "Does Voss know about her?" Celeste thought. "I don't think I've ever mentioned her in any context he would have been part of." "Think carefully," she thought. "No, I'm certain. I keep my family completely separate from my professional security arrangements. Ruth knows about my sister. My assistant knows her first name for scheduling purposes. Voss had no reason to know she exists. Maya goes to Fort Collins. Quietly. Not from the house in a car that leaves a record. Think about how." Celeste was already thinking about how. He could see it. The meeting ended 15 minutes later. Briggs walked Grant to the elevator with the expression of a man who had questions he was arranging into an order. "How sure are you about the feint?" Briggs asked. "Not sure." "Probably. If the people behind this are operating at the level Celeste thinks, they're not going to take a loss without trying to recover something from it." Grant pressed the elevator button. "They still want the board outcome. The method just needs to change. And you think they'll move in the next 48 hours. I think if I were them and I had any move left to make, I'd make it before the federal investigation gets traction. After that, the risk calculus changes significantly. The elevator arrived. Grant stepped in. Briggs held the door briefly. "You know you're not officially part of this investigation," Briggs said.
I know.
"And you're planning to stay involved anyway." Grant considered the question. "I'm planning to make sure a 10-year-old stays safe. What that looks like depends on the next 48 hours. Briggs looked at him for a moment. Then he let the door go. The drive back to Celeste's property took 22 minutes. Grant spent most of it thinking about the fence gap and the camera angles and the specific phrasing Voss had used when he'd asked Celeste about the investigation, where it came from, not who was behind it. The phrasing of a man checking on whether his name was in the fire yet. He arrived at the property at 3:40 and found two things he hadn't expected. The first was that Celeste was already there, having followed close behind him without his noticing, which told him something about how fast she drove on mountain roads. The second was that his phone was ringing as he cut the engine, and the number on the screen was not one he recognized, and when he answered it, the voice on the other end was male. Unhurried, and completely calm in the specific way that people were calm when they were choosing to perform calm rather than feel it. "Mr. Maddox," the voice said, "we've been watching you for the past 2 days. I want to offer you an opportunity to step away from this before it becomes a problem for you, personally." Grant sat very still in the driver's seat. Outside the windshield, Celeste was walking toward the front entrance of the house with her phone in her hand, not yet aware that he had stopped. "I'm listening," Grant said. He kept his voice completely neutral. He was already thinking about the call's duration. The background sounds, the specific cadence of the voice, not rushed, not threatened, not desperate. The voice of someone who still believed they had control of the situation. "You're a single father," the voice continued. "Construction contractor. You make decent money, you have a nice enough house, you have an 8-year-old daughter who goes to art class on Tuesdays." A pause, deliberate, theatrical. "It would be very unfortunate if your involvement in a situation that doesn't concern you created complications for your family." The line of pine trees at the edge of the property moved in the wind. Grant said nothing for 3 full seconds. He was counting them. "You there," the voice said. "I'm here," Grant said. "I'm thinking about how to answer you. Take your time." "All right." Grant kept his eyes on the tree line. "Here's my answer. You just told me 2 things. The first is that you're watching this property, which means you're close enough to have seen me arrive. The second is that you know where my daughter goes on Tuesdays." He paused. "So now I need you to listen carefully, because I'm only going to say this once." Silence on the line. "You should have stayed away from the kids," Grant said. He ended the call and was out of the truck in the same motion. He was already moving towards Celeste before she turned around, his voice carrying across the motor court with the quietness that held more urgency than shouting. "Get inside, right now, and call Briggs." She read his face and didn't ask why. She went. Grant stood in the motor court for one more moment, looking at the tree line, at the gap in the fence coverage, at the camera on the south corner that didn't quite reach. 48 hours, he had told Briggs. He had been wrong about the timeline. It was already starting. Grant stood in the motor court for 30 seconds after Celeste went inside, long enough to fix in his mind the exact positions of every camera, every shadow line, every gap between what the system could see and what it couldn't. The tree line was still. No movement at the fence. Whoever had made the call was either watching from a distance with optics or had someone on the ground close enough to observe arrivals without being caught on the perimeter cameras. The gap in the south fence, he thought. Same gap Voss had designed. He went inside. Celeste was already on the phone with Briggs, standing in the front hallway with her back against the wall and her free hand pressed flat against it, the way people pressed against solid things when they needed the reminder that solid things existed. Grant heard her relaying the call in compressed, accurate language, no editorializing, no panic, just the facts in the order they had happened. He noted this the way he noted most things about her, with the quiet recognition that she was someone who functioned well under conditions designed to make people fall apart. Ruth appeared from the kitchen doorway, looked at both of them, and disappeared again without asking a question. 20 seconds later, she came back with a glass of water that she set on the hallway table without a word and went back to the kitchen. Grant had a feeling Ruth had been doing that providing small, practical things at exactly the right moment for a long time. He picked up the water and drank half of it. Celeste ended the call. Briggs is pulling the call records on the number right now. He says it'll trace to a burner, but he wants the attempt. She looked at Grant. He also said you should have stayed in the truck. He's right, Grant said. I should have stayed in the truck and kept the call going longer. Them talk. Why didn't you? Because they mentioned Piper. He said it simply, without drama, and Celeste was quiet for a moment in a way that indicated she understood the difference between a tactical error and a human one and wasn't going to press the point. Where is she right now? Celeste asked. After school program until 5:30. I need to make a call. Use the study. It's the most secure line in the house. He used the study. The woman who ran Piper's after-school program was named Mrs. Delacroix, and she was 70 years old and ran her program with the iron confidence of someone who had been managing children and parents for 4 decades and found both groups equally manageable. Grant told her, without excessive detail, that he needed Piper held inside until he personally arrived to collect her, and that nobody else was authorized to pick up his daughter for any reason, regardless of what they said. Mrs. Delacroix said, understood, in the tone of a woman who had prepared for exactly this kind of call and found it only slightly more serious than the usual parental anxieties she navigated daily. Grant came back out of the study. Cardwell was already there. He had arrived in the time it took Grant to make his call, which said something about how close federal attention had been hovering over this situation. He was in the same unremarkable jacket as the day before, standing in the center of the living room with the specific stillness of a man conserving energy he might need later. Call, Cardwell said to Grant. I've told Briggs everything. Tell me. Grant did. Cardwell listened without interrupting, which was the mark of a competent interviewer, letting the witness move at their own speed rather than steering them into the shape you expected. When Grant finished, Cardwell was quiet for a moment. They know you, Cardwell said. They've looked into you. They know your daughter's schedule. Yes, that's not a casual operation. Looking into a civilian bystander who intervened, identifying his family, making a threat call, that's significant resource expenditure. Cardwell looked at him steadily, which means they've assessed you as a genuine threat to their objective. Good, Grant said. Cardwell blinked once. Most people would find that alarming. Most people haven't been assessed as a genuine threat before. It tells you where you stand. Celeste was sitting on the couch with her legs crossed and her hands in her lap, watching this exchange. She had the expression she got. Grant had already learned to read several of her expressions when she was taking in information and organizing it without showing the organization process. There's a property, she said. Both men looked at her. Voss would know about it. A secondary property 40 minutes from here, in the foothills above Creston. I used it twice as an off-site meeting location when the main office was being renovated 2 years ago. It's in a holding company name, not my personal name, but Voss had access to all property documentation. She paused. He also would have told them about it, if they're planning to use it or to direct me toward it. Why would they direct you toward it? Reyes asked. She had come in behind Cardwell. Grant hadn't noticed exactly when. Because if the primary operation is compromised, the secondary play is to create a situation that draws me out. Isolated, off-property, away from whatever security I've rebuilt. Celeste's voice was level. They'd need a reason for me to go there voluntarily. Credible reason. Grant was already thinking it. Voss. Celeste looked at him. They'll use Voss, Grant said. Or the appearance of Voss. A message that sounds like it's coming from him through a lawyer, through a trusted contact that claims new evidence has emerged and needs to be reviewed at a secure location. Something that sounds procedurally legitimate. Something that would make you feel like you needed to be there personally. Cardwell had taken out the too cheap notebook. You're anticipating a staged contact. I'm anticipating what I'd do if the first operation failed, and I still needed to accomplish the original objective. Grant looked at Celeste. Has anything come through in the last 2 hours that fits that description? A message from someone associated with Voss's legal situation? A call from a number you didn't recognize but that presented itself as official? Celeste's expression shifted. Just slightly. Just enough. My assistant forwarded something 20 minutes before you arrived, she said slowly. An email. From an address I didn't recognize. It said it was from the office of Voss's defense attorney, requesting that I come to the Creston property tomorrow morning to review security documentation that Voss had stored there. And that was, quote, relevant to my ongoing protection. The room was quiet. I was going to ask you about it, she said to Grant. Then, to Cardwell, I didn't open the attachment. Don't, Cardwell said immediately. Forward the entire email to me right now. Don't interact with the address in any way. She had her phone out before he finished the sentence. Cardwell looked at Grant. Grant looked back at him. The unspoken thing between them was the same unspoken thing, which was that the trap was already baited, and the only question was whether to walk into it with the right preparation or not walk into it at all. We use it, Grant said. I agree, Cardwell said. But you'll need time to set up a perimeter at the Creston property. You'll need someone who can go in ahead of whoever they're sending to watch the approach. And you'll need Celeste to appear to accept the invitation so they believe the trap is working. Grant paused. You'll also need Maya completely off the board before any of this happens. Because if they're watching this property, they may try to use her as a pressure mechanism once they see Celeste heading toward Creston. Maya is already going to Fort Collins, Celeste said. Tonight, I'm putting her in Ruth's car, not a company vehicle, with Ruth driving. They leave in 3 hours. Not Ruth's personal car, Grant said. Ruth's personal car is registered to her name and address. They've done their homework on the household. Celeste closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. My sister's car. She drove down this morning when I called her. It's in the garage. Grant nodded. That works. Cardwell had been on his phone for the past 45 seconds, speaking low and fast. He ended the call and looked at the room. I can have 4 agents at the Creston property by 9 tonight. If we're treating this as a controlled approach, I need the scenario staged carefully. Ms. Arden, you'll respond to the email tonight. Confirm the meeting for 10 tomorrow morning. We'll have the property surrounded before 6 a.m. And Dreyer, Briggs said from the doorway. Grant hadn't heard him come in either, which told him his situational awareness had degraded from 2 days without enough sleep. The second name Voss gave. Dreyer was the operational coordinator. If this is a second attempt, Dreyer is likely running it. You have a photo? Briggs had a photo. He pulled it up on his phone and showed the room. The man in the image was 40-something, unremarkable in the specific way that suggested effort, the kind of face that matched 50 other faces on any given street. Sandy hair going gray, medium build, a way of holding himself that was neither relaxed nor tense. Grant studied it for 5 seconds. I want a copy of that.
You're not going to the Creston property,
Cardwell said. I know. I mean it. I heard you. Grant looked at Cardwell with the steady patience he used when someone was telling him something he already knew and had already accounted for. I have my own reasons for wanting that photo. Cardwell studied him briefly, then sent the image to Grant's phone without further discussion. The next 3 hours were organized chaos of the kind that Grant had lived inside, often enough to move through it without getting tangled. Maya came home from school in the car Celeste had arranged a vehicle with no connection to the Arden security network. Driven by a woman named Daria, who was an old college friend of Celeste's and who had no idea why she was being asked to do this, and had asked no questions, which Grant gathered was a quality Celeste had selected for in her personal relationships over years. Maya came through the door and went immediately to her mother, not in the clinging way of a child who hadn't recovered, but in the direct, purposeful way of a child who needed to confirm something with her own eyes before she could move forward. She put her arms around Celeste for about 4 seconds, then stepped back and looked at her mother's face. What's happening now? Maya said. Celeste crouched to her daughter's level. She didn't use the softened voice that some parents used when they were managing children through frightening situations, the voice that telegraphed, beneath the softness, that the situation was in fact frightening. She used her regular voice, which was controlled and direct. You're going to Aunt Delia's tonight, she said, with Ruth. You'll stay for a few days, because it's not safe here. Because I want to know you're somewhere quiet while some things get sorted out. Maya looked at her with the expression of a 10-year-old who was fully capable of identifying a managed truth from a complete one and had decided to accept the managed version because she trusted the person delivering it. Okay, she said. Can I bring my sketchbook? Bring 2. Maya nodded and went upstairs without further discussion. Grant watched this from across the room and thought about the kind of child you became when you grew up, watching one parent carry everything alone. Piper arrived at 5:45, collected by Grant personally from Mrs. Delacroix's program. He brought her back to the Arden property because taking her home to an empty house while people who knew her Tuesday schedule were making phone calls was not an option he was prepared to accept, and Celeste had said, without hesitation, to bring her when Grant mentioned the situation. Piper walked into the Arden house with the careful attention of a child entering an unfamiliar space and trying to map it quickly. She had her backpack on both shoulders and was wearing the puffy blue jacket she'd had since second grade that was starting to be too small across the shoulders. Took in the high ceilings and the stone floors and the view through the main window of the mountains going amber in the late light. Wow, she said with genuine simplicity. It's a lot, Grant said. It's really a lot. She turned to look at him. Is this Maya's house?
Yeah.
Cool, she said it the way 8-year-olds said cool, meaning it, but not performing it. Then, is Maya here? She's upstairs. You can go up in a minute. The two girls were together for 2 hours before Ruth loaded the car for Fort Collins. Grant watched the departure from the front doorway Maya with her 2 sketchbooks and a duffel bag, Ruth with the calm efficiency of someone who packed quickly and well, Celeste's sister Delia at the wheel of a 10-year-old Subaru that had a cracked rear bumper and an air freshener shaped like a pine tree hanging from the mirror. Nothing about the car said wealth or access or protection. It said ordinary. That was exactly right. Maya hugged her mother at the car door for longer than 4 seconds this time, and Celeste held on with both arms and her eyes closed, and when Maya got in and the car moved down the drive, Celeste stood and watched until the taillights disappeared into the pine trees. She stood there for a moment after the lights were gone. Grant came and stood beside her. Not close, just nearby. She's going to be fine, he said. I know. A pause. I know that. I just keep doing the calculation where I imagine what would have happened if you hadn't been on that sidewalk. Don't do that calculation. It doesn't go anywhere useful. I know that too. She turned back toward the house. I'm not good at not running calculations, I've noticed. She almost laughed. Not quite, but close. Is that a problem? No. It's useful. Mostly. Sometimes it goes to places that make things harder than they need to be. Stopped at the door and looked at him. The porch light was on, and it caught the tiredness in her face, which she usually kept well hidden under the other things she kept there. You know, that's a description that applies to both of us. Grant considered arguing and decided she was right. Inside, Piper was on the couch with the dog she had apparently discovered within 7 minutes of arriving, and she was giving it the kind of earnest, serious attention she gave to things she'd decided mattered. The dog was a large, soft-faced animal of indeterminate mix that had come to rest its head on Piper's knee with a total commitment of a creature that had correctly identified a sympathetic human. He likes her, Celeste said, mildly surprised. He was named Barnard, which Grant learned from Piper when she said, Dad, this is Barnard, with the introduction of someone presenting a new important acquaintance. Barnard, Grant repeated. He's very smart, Piper said. I told him to sit and he did it. He sits for anyone, Celeste said. He did it in a smart way, Piper said, with the finality of someone whose mind was not for changing on this point. Celeste looked at Grant. He looked back at her. He saw the thing move through her face again. That brief loosening, the same thing he'd seen in the studio when Maya and Piper were talking beside each other with their heads bent together. Like a window opening in a room that was usually sealed. Ruth had left dinner on the stove before her departure. They ate at the kitchen table, all 3 of them, which had not been planned and which required no discussion, because Piper simply climbed into a chair and reached for the breadbasket with the comfortable certainty of a child who had decided she was staying, and that was the end of the question. Grant thought about the 40-minute drive home, and thought about the empty house, and thought about who had access to his address, and none of those calculations recommended the 40-minute drive tonight. You're staying, Celeste said. It wasn't a question. If that's fine. She said it simply, meaning it. There are 4 guest rooms. Pick one. You and Piper. Piper looked at Grant with an expression of restrained hope. Okay, he said. Piper's expression resolved into satisfaction. She ate her dinner. Later, After Piper was asleep in a guest room with Barnard at the foot of the bed, a boundary that Celeste had apparently established and that Barnard had apparently accepted as the kind of suggestion that applied to most people, Grant sat in the kitchen. With a cup of coffee he wasn't going to finish, and his phone on the table, showing the photo of Dreyer that Briggs had sent. He heard Celeste before he saw her. She came into the kitchen in a different jacket, older, the kind of jacket that lived on a hook near the back door rather than in a closet, and she poured herself the end of the coffee and sat across from him. She looked at Dreyer's photo. "You're trying to remember if you've seen him." "I'm trying to remember if anything about him connects to anything else." Grant turned the phone face down. "Probably not productive. Probably." She wrapped both hands around her mug. "Can I ask you something that isn't about any of this?" "Sure," Piper's mother. She stopped herself. "That's not my business. She left when Piper was 3, Grant said. It wasn't a painful thing to say. Not anymore. It had been, for a time, and then it had become a fact, which was different. She wasn't wrong to leave. We were wrong for each other before Piper was born, and we both knew it and neither of us said it. She's in Portland now. She calls on birthdays." He paused. "Piper seems okay about it. I think she actually is okay about it most of the time. She has moments. What do you do during the moments?" "I sit with her. I don't try to fix it." He picked up the coffee cup and put it down again. "You can't fix it. You can just be there while it passes." Celeste was quiet for a moment. "I haven't been good at sitting with things. I try to fix them. I've noticed. Is that a problem?" She said it back to him, his own phrase from earlier, with the faintest dry edge. "Sometimes," he said honestly. "Tonight it's fine." She smiled at that, not the almost smile from earlier. An actual one, tired and real, the kind that didn't have any performance in it. He realized he'd been watching for that specific smile for 2 days, without knowing he was watching for it, and that realization sat in his chest with a weight that was not uncomfortable, exactly, but that he wasn't prepared to look at directly. He looked at the table instead. "You should sleep," he said. "Tomorrow's going to need you sharp. I won't sleep. You'll sleep better than you would if you stayed up. That's worth something." She looked at him for a moment with the assessing look, and this time he had the impression she wasn't trying to find the angle or the ask. She was just looking. "Okay," she said. She took her mug to the sink, rinsed it, and set it in the rack with the care of someone who had been raised to clean up after herself before anyone could do it for them. Paused at the kitchen doorway, Grant. He looked up. "Thank you for staying." He nodded. She went. He stayed at the table for another 30 minutes, looking at nothing in particular, thinking about the Creston property and Dreyer's face and the gap in the south fence, and the way Piper had said this is Barnard, with the confidence of someone introducing a new friend. Thinking about 48 hours that hadn't gone the way he predicted, and had gone exactly the way he should have predicted. Then he went to check the perimeter, all the locks, the camera feeds on the security panel in the hall, the gate status, and went to the guest room across from Piper's, and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark for a while, before lying down. He was asleep faster than he expected. He woke at 5:12 to his phone buzzing. "Cardwell. We're at the Creston property," Cardwell said, without any greeting. 4 agents, 2 vehicles set up in the tree line on the north and east approaches. Briggs has 2 unmarked on the access road. A pause. "Something you should know. We ran the property ownership on the shell company holding this address. 3 layers deep, it traces back to a holding entity connected to Meridian Group's parent company in Delaware." Grant was already sitting up, already fully awake in the way he'd trained himself to be. They own the property. They own the shell that owns it. Which means the email directing Ms. Arden here wasn't a trap they improvised. They had this location in reserve. It was part of the original plan. The original plan included a fallback, Grant said. The original plan was more sophisticated than we initially assessed. Cardwell's voice was flat. They anticipated that the first attempt might not fully succeed. Property was always the secondary stage. Grant stood and went to the window. Dawn was beginning somewhere behind the mountains, but hadn't arrived yet. The motor court below was dark and still. They were going to stage the ransom exchange here, he said. The abduction worked. They bring Celeste here under the cover of negotiation. Failed. So they're using the email to bring her here anyway, under a different cover. That's our read, Dreyer. Is he there? not yet. We're watching. He'll come early, before the scheduled time. He'll want to check the property and confirm she's coming before he fully commits. Grant turned from the window. How far out are you from the main building? Tree line is roughly 40 yards north. Another position at 60 yards east. Dreyer will approach from the south. The access road comes from the north, so the natural assumption for a surveillance setup is north and east. He'll go south. A pause. We don't have coverage on the south. I know. Maddox, I'm not suggesting anything, Grant said. I'm telling you where he'll come from. Another pause. Longer. Is there a southern approach road? Single lane. Unpaved. It's on the county parcel map as a fire road. Voss had access to all property documentation, including auxiliary access. How do you know about the fire road? I looked at the county parcel map for this property last night while you were setting up. It's public record. The pause this time had a different quality. Cardwell. You need coverage on the southern approach, Grant said. That's all I'm saying. I have 4 agents. I know how many agents you have. A long pause. Where are you right now? In a guest room at the Arden property. Where you told me to stay. Cardwell was quiet for several seconds. Grant heard him breathing and heard, distantly, the sound of wind moving through trees that wasn't coming from anywhere near Celeste's property. The fire road connects to Route 9 about 2 miles south of the property, Cardwell said, and his voice had changed to the tone of a man who had made a decision about something and wasn't going to formalize it with words. I know, Grant said. 2 miles of unpaved road through pine forest at this time of year. Probably 30 minutes from the Route 9 junction at walking pace. Probably, Grant said. Another pause. My agents are watching the north and east. I can't legally authorize anyone to cover the south approach. I understand that. I'll check in with you in 2 hours. I'll have my phone, Grant said. Cardwell ended the call. Grant put on his jacket and his boots. He wrote a note on the pad beside the guest room phone on property. Back by 10. Call Cardwell if anything changes, and left it where Celeste would find it, which he judged to be on the kitchen counter near the coffee maker, which is where he left it. He went out through the side door, not the main entrance, and he did it at 5:23 in the morning, before full light. With the Dreyer photo fixed in his mind and the layout of the Creston property's southern approach mapped from the parcel data he had looked at until he could close his eyes and walk it. Route 9 junction, 2 miles of fire road, 30 minutes at walking pace. Dreyer, if he was running true to form, would want to be at the property by 7:30. Latest. Grant moved at a pace that was not quite running. He needed to be in the trees before Dreyer was on the road. The fire road was exactly where the parcel map had shown it a break in the pine line off Route 9, marked by a rusted metal gate that had not been locked in what looked like several seasons. The ground was hard with overnight frost, and Grant's breath showed white in the cold pre-dawn air. He pushed through the gate and moved into the trees and found a natural position behind a granite outcropping about 100 yards up the road where he could see the approach in both directions without being visible from either. He checked his phone. 5:51. No signal which he'd expected this far into the foothills. He waited. At 6:44, he heard a vehicle on the fire road not from the south, from above, which meant someone had come onto the road from the property end and was moving toward his position, toward Route 9, which was the opposite of what he'd expected. Grant pressed himself against the granite and went still. A white sedan rolled slowly past his position, moving carefully over the frozen ruts. Through the trees he could see the driver, sandy hair going gray, medium build, the specific face of someone professionally unremarkable. Dreyer had already been at the property. He had arrived before dawn, before even the time Grant had estimated, which meant Dreyer was more careful and more experienced than the operational profile suggested. And Grant had been right about the south approach and wrong about the timing. And both of those things were now equally true, and he had to work with both. Dreyer was leaving, checking the route, satisfying himself it was clear, and going back to wherever he staged himself before the actual meeting, which meant he would return on this road later, once Celeste arrived. The white sedan reached the Route 9 junction and turned south. Grant already had his phone out, moving to higher ground for signal, because there was something else on the fire road that Dreyer had not seen on his way out, and that Grant needed to report before 7 o'clock. 20 yards from where Grant had been waiting, partially concealed by a fallen pine, was a second vehicle. Dark-colored, engine cold, which meant it had been there before Dreyer arrived. It was facing up the road, toward the property. It was not a federal vehicle. Grant knew federal vehicle types the way he knew most things from accumulated, practical familiarity, and this was not one. Whoever was in that car was watching the fire road from the other side. And they weren't there because Cardwell had sent them. He got enough signal at higher ground to make the call. Cardwell picked up on the first ring. "There's a second vehicle on the fire road," Grant said. Dark sedan, about 100 yards from the Route 9 junction, facing north. "Engine cold, been there at least 2 hours. Not yours?" "Not mine." Cardwell's voice had sharpened. "Dreyer?" "Dreyer just left in a white sedan heading south on Route 9 about 4 minutes ago. The dark vehicle is separate." Grant looked down the slope toward the fire road. "They're watching the road, watching who comes in from the south. If Celeste had driven herself here, she wouldn't have made it to the property," Cardwell said. "All right, I need you away from that vehicle right now. Move north, up the fire road, toward the property." "Go." "Already moving," Grant said. He was already moving. Behind him, down the slope, he heard a car door open and close with the careful quietness of someone who had heard a sound they weren't supposed to hear and had decided to check it. Grant moved faster. The fire road ahead curved north and upward through the pine forest toward the Creston property, where 4 federal agents were waiting in the tree line without coverage on the south, toward a building that someone had planned around for months, toward a meeting that had been engineered from before the first attempt had even been made. His boots crunched once on a frost-cracked branch. He slowed. The sound behind him had stopped. He listened to the mountain morning for 3 full seconds. Then he heard it, the low sound of someone moving through frozen pine needles, deliberate and slow, from somewhere below and to his right. He wasn't alone on the fire road. He called Cardwell back on the move. 1 bar of signal, maybe 2. "Someone's following me up from the south," he said quietly. 1 person, maybe 2. I need you to know where I am." "I know where you are," Cardwell said. "Keep moving north. Do not stop. We're coming to you." Grant kept moving north. The trees were dense enough to limit sight lines to 30 feet in most directions. The frost on the ground made silence nearly impossible for anyone moving at any real speed. Grant used this. He knew his position. He had the sound of the person behind him, and he could judge distance from the pattern of their footfalls. 40 feet back, moving at his pace to keep the gap consistent. Someone with enough discipline not to close too fast. Professional. He came around the fire road's north curve, and the Creston property's rear fence line appeared through the trees, about 60 yards ahead. Beyond it, the building a low 2-story stone structure, dark in the early morning. And from the east tree line, 2 figures in federal jackets moving fast in his direction. Behind him, the footsteps stopped. Then the sound of someone moving fast back down the road, south toward Route 9, breaking discipline because the calculation had changed. Grant stopped. He breathed. He let Cardwell's agents reach him and confirm he was standing and unharmed, and he looked back through the trees at the empty fire road. "The person behind me is going to reach Route 9 in about 6 minutes, he said to the agent who arrived first. "There's a dark sedan down there. If your people aren't on Route 9 in 5. The agent was already on the radio. Grant stood in the cold mountain morning with his pulse coming down from where it had gone, and the pine trees standing around him in the particular indifferent silence of trees that had stood through everything and planned to stand through whatever came next. He thought about the call he'd gotten yesterday, the voice that had named Piper with calculated precision. The voice of someone who believed that naming the thing you loved most was sufficient to make you stop. He thought about Celeste standing at the front door of her house after Maya's taillights disappeared. Specific quality of her stillness in that moment, not numbness, not defeat. Just the willingness to hold something painful without making it smaller than it was. He thought about Piper asleep on a guest room bed with a dog named Barnard at her feet, and the note he'd left by the coffee maker, and the fact that by the time Celeste read that note, this would either be resolved or it would be something much harder. Cardwell appeared from the north, coming from the direction of the main building, with 2 more agents flanking him. He looked at Grant for a long moment, The sedan on Route 9 was intercepted, he said. 2 men. One of them is talking. Grant said nothing. The third name, Cardwell, continued. The one Voss claimed he'd only heard once. One of the men in the sedan just confirmed it. He paused. It's Harwick, Regional VP of Operations for Meridian Group's Western Division. Can you hold him? 24 hours before we need to charge or release. Federal connection gives us leverage on the timeline. Cardwell looked at Grant with the lateral assessment that Grant had gotten used to over the past 3 days. The man in the sedan also said something else. He said the secondary objective, if the Creston meeting failed, was the girl. In Fort Collins. Grant had his phone out before Cardwell finished the sentence. Called Celeste. She answered on the first ring, which meant she was already awake and already waiting. Call your sister, Grant said. Right now. Tell her to take Maya and Ruth and leave the house. Doesn't matter where. Just somewhere with people and lights. Go now, and keep them on the phone until I tell you it's clear. He heard her breath catch once, just once, and then she was already dialing. He stood in the frozen pine forest on the side of a mountain in Colorado and listened to Cardwell direct his agents and felt the cold coming up through the ground and thought about all the things that money could build around a person and all the ways those things could be turned and all the places where none of it was sufficient. And he thought about an 8-year-old girl telling a 10-year-old girl in a studio lobby that her dad leaned against things and the 10-year-old girl looking at him and saying, I noticed. And both of those children, right now, asleep in different houses, waiting for the adults in their lives to get it right. He kept his phone in his hand and waited for Celeste's voice to come back on the line and tell him her sister had answered. Celeste's sister answered on the third ring. Grant heard Celeste's voice change the moment the call connected, not softer, exactly, but less armored. The way voices changed when they reached someone they had known long enough to drop the professional layer. She said Delia's name, and then said the rest of it in a rapid, flat sequence that left no room for questions. And Grant could tell from Celeste's side of the conversation that Delia was the kind of person who didn't ask questions when questions weren't the point. There was movement on the other end, the sounds of a house waking up fast, and within 90 seconds, Celeste said okay 3 times and ended the call. They're leaving, she said into the phone to Grant. Delia has a friend 4 blocks away. She's taking them there. Does anyone connected to you know about this friend? No. Delia picked her. I don't even know her name. Good. Tell Delia to stay off her regular phone once they're there. Any updates come through you to me. Grant looked at Cardwell, who had his own phone to his ear and was moving back toward the property's main building with his agents fanning out around him, in the practiced way of people executing a plan they had rehearsed. Celeste. It's coming apart for them. The men in the sedan are in custody. Dreyer left the property before we got here, which means he's going to find out very soon that his ground coverage is gone. When that happens, he runs, she said, or he makes a final move. Either way, the active threat window is closing. He paused. Maya is safe. You're safe. Stay at the house until I call you back. A silence. Grant. Yeah. Be careful. She said it the way people said things they meant but weren't accustomed to saying without decoration, without softening it into something smaller than it was. I'll call you in an hour, he said. He didn't say he'd be careful. Because careful was a variable he could only partially control, and she was smart enough to know that, and he wasn't going to make her a promise shaped like a certainty that wasn't one. What happened over the following 4 hours was the kind of thing that looked, from the outside, like a sudden collapse, the way things that have been under pressure for a long time finally give way and seem to go all at once. But Grant had been inside enough operations to know that sudden collapses were never actually sudden. They were the accumulated weight of small failures reaching a threshold, and everything after the threshold was just gravity. Dreyer was located at 947 at a motel 18 miles east of Creston, a budget place off the interstate that he had checked into under a name that wasn't his, but that matched an ID well enough to get him a room key. He was arrested by 2 of Cardwell's agents and a local sheriff's deputy without incident, which disappointed no one and surprised no one, because men like Dreyer were dangerous in the planning and the execution, but they were not men who fought when the fight was clearly over. They were calculators. The calculation had come up wrong, and he understood that as clearly as anyone. The third man from the sedan was a lower-level operative whose name turned out to be Pollard. And Pollard had the specific quality of fear that comes from someone who has done something for money that he now understood was going to cost him far more than money. He gave Cardwell everything he had within the first 40 minutes of a federal interview, including documentation he had stored on a cloud account under a personal email, which was the kind of operational security mistake that only happened when people believed they were building an archive for their own protection rather than a gift for investigators. That documentation connected Harwick, the Meridian Group regional VP, to the original planning of the abduction attempt, to the funding of Voss's advance payment, and to 2 prior operations against other targets in Meridian's competitive space that federal investigators had been trying to connect to a central organizing entity for the better part of 2 years. Harwick was arrested at his Denver office at 11:15 on a Tuesday morning. He was on a conference call when the agents arrived and apparently asked them to wait while he finished his point, which they did not do. Grant was back at Celeste property by 10:30. He found her in the kitchen with a cup of coffee she had clearly been holding for a long time without drinking, sitting at the table where they had sat the night before. She looked up when he came in. He looked different than he had. At 5 in the morning, the frost was gone from his jacket, but there was a weariness in the set of his shoulders that hadn't been there before, the specific kind that came from sustained alertness, finally releasing its grip. "Sit down," she said. He sat. She poured him coffee without asking. He drank it. "Dreyer's in custody," he said. "Harwick was arrested in Denver this morning. The federal case is active. Cardwell says the DA's office is already talking to Meridian's parent company about the scope of the investigation." Celeste absorbed this. She set down her own mug. "It's over. The active threat is over. The legal process is just starting, which is its own thing." He looked at her. "But Maya is safe. You're safe. The people who built this are in custody." She nodded. She was quiet for a long moment, not the tight quiet of someone holding something back, but the quieter quiet of someone who had been running on emergency fuel for 4 days and had just gotten permission to stop. "I called my board chair this morning," she said, "before you came back. I told him everything, Voss. Meridian, the attempted abduction, the federal investigation. Everything. How did he take it?" He was furious. Appropriately so. A pause. He was also the one who insisted on the competency review clause in the original charter. He understood immediately what Meridian had been trying to use it for. She looked at her hands on the table. "He's calling an emergency board meeting this week to formally remove that clause and issue a public statement of support for my leadership. He said, and I'm quoting him directly, that anyone who tries to take a company by terrorizing the founder's child deserves whatever federal prosecutors have planned for them." "He's not wrong," Grant said. "No," she looked up. "Patent decision goes forward on the original timeline. Meridian's claim to the competing space is going to be considerably complicated by a federal conspiracy investigation." Something moved across her face that wasn't quite satisfaction and wasn't quite relief. It was the expression of someone watching a long-running injustice correct itself, which was a different thing from either of those and less comfortable than both. "I didn't build this company to win by watching my competitors get arrested. I built it because the technology matters and the patients it serves matter." "I know," Grant said, "but I'm not going to pretend I'm not glad they're in handcuffs." "That's a human response," Grant said. "You're allowed to have it." She looked at him across the table. Morning light had come fully into the kitchen by now, the mountain kind of light that was clear and cold and showed everything, without the softening that lower altitude light sometimes provided. She looked tired in that light. She also looked, Grant thought, more like herself than she had at any point in the past 4 days, as if the sustained emergency had burned away some layer of the public version, and what remained was the actual person underneath. "Piper's still asleep," Celeste said. "I figured. Told Ruth last night, apparently, that Barnard was the best dog she had ever met in her life." A small pause. "She's met a grand total of 4 dogs, according to her own account." "Building a sample," Grant said. "You have to start somewhere." This time Celeste did laugh. Not the almost law or the brief functional smile, an actual laugh, short and genuine, the kind that arrived before the person could decide whether it was appropriate. She pressed her fingers to her mouth afterward with the slight embarrassment of someone surprised by their own reaction. "Sorry," she said. Don't apologize for that. She took her hand away from her mouth. I don't know what to do with you, she said. It wasn't a complaint. It was an honest statement of a genuine problem she had been working on for 4 days. You don't have to do anything with me, Grant said. I'll go home today. Piper has school tomorrow. I know. She turned the mug in her hands. Maya is going to ask about Piper. She texted me this morning 8 questions in a row. The 7th one was whether Piper was coming back. A pause. Maya doesn't make friends easily. She's like me. Keeps people at a distance until she decides they're worth the risk. Piper's persistent, Grant said. She decides who matters, and then she doesn't really leave them alone until it's mutual. That's either a very good quality or an exhausting one. Both, Grant said, depending on the day. Celeste almost smiled again. I'd like Maya to see her, when the immediate situation settles. I think that can be arranged. She looked at him with the careful look. And I think it would be, she stopped. She was not, he had observed, a person who stumbled over words. Stumbling was itself information. Yes, he said. She blinked. I hadn't finished, I know. But the answer is yes, whatever it is. She held his gaze for a moment. Something in her settled not dramatically, not like a scene from something, just the small internal shift of a person who has been braced for a response and received something different from what they expected. I was going to ask if you'd be willing to consult on the new security structure, she said. The actual question. Before you made it strange. I didn't make it strange. You answered before I finished speaking. The answer was still yes. She shook her head, but the thing at the corners of her mouth gave her away. Maya came home on Thursday. Ruth drove her back from Fort Collins in Delia's Subaru. And when she came through the front door, she went to her mother the same way she had gone to her, after the studio, purposefully, directly, not as a child seeking comfort, but as a person confirming the presence of someone important. She held on for the 4 seconds, and then she stepped back and took stock of the house, as if checking that it was the same house she had left. Barnard, she said. The dog appeared from the kitchen, with the enthusiasm of an animal who had learned in 2 days that the small humans in this house were a reliable source of attention and floor-level affection. Maya got down on the floor and let him climb on her and did not care at all about her clothes. Celeste stood in the hallway and watched this and felt something unclench in her chest that had been clenched for the better part of a week. The federal investigation moved through its phases, with the grinding, impersonal efficiency of federal investigations. Harwick was charged on 7 counts, including conspiracy to commit kidnapping, wire fraud, and corporate espionage. Dreyer faced kidnapping, conspiracy, and organized crime association charges that Cardwell told Celeste would likely result in a significant sentence, given the prior documented operations Pollard's cloud archive had connected him to. Voss pled to a reduced conspiracy charge in exchange for continued cooperation, and received a sentence that would take years from his life, not enough years. Celeste felt on some days, and on other days she tried not to calculate it. The Meridian Group's board distanced itself from Harwick with the speed of a corporate entity that had lawyers who worked fast and had clearly identified the path of least institutional damage. Whether anyone else at Meridian had known what Harwick was doing was a question the federal investigation continued examining, and Celeste had been advised not to comment publicly while that process was active. She found this restraint genuinely difficult, and only managed it by directing the energy into the work, which had always been her most reliable mechanism for managing things she couldn't directly control. Patent licensing decision was finalized 6 weeks after the arrests. Celeste's company secured the primary licensing position. She did not celebrate publicly. She wrote a company-wide memo that focused on the team's technical work over the past 3 years and mentioned nothing about Meridian. And she made a private donation to an organization that provided legal advocacy for families affected by child exploitation, and she considered that sufficient acknowledgement of what had happened. Grant consulted on the new security structure across 4 sessions spread over 6 weeks, which was approximately the right amount of time to build something sound without overbuilding it. He identified 4 additional gaps in the existing camera coverage, recommended a monitoring service that was independent of any single internally managed position, and suggested a set of protocols for Maya's school transportation that could be maintained without being visible as a security apparatus to the outside world. He did not take payment for this work. Celeste tried 3 times by 3 different methods to compensate him, and each time he declined with the same uncomplicated directness, and after the 3rd time, she stopped trying because she was smart enough to understand that the declining was not a negotiation position. What happened between them over those 6 weeks was not a story with a clear shape. It was quieter than that and less organized. It was Maya and Piper spending a Saturday at the property, 2 of them in the lower field with Barnard running between them, while Grant and Celeste sat on the back porch with coffee and talked about things that had nothing to do with security assessments or federal investigations. It was Celeste showing up at one of Piper's school events because Maya had asked if she could come, and Grant had said yes. And the 4 of them getting dinner afterward at a diner near the school, where the booths were the old vinyl kind, and the menus were laminated, and Piper explained at length to Maya the precise criteria by which she was rating all the dogs she had ever met. It was Grant driving 4 hours through a snowstorm in late January, because Celeste's assistant had called him to say that Celeste had received the deposition schedule for the Harwick trial and had gone very quiet in a way the assistant found. And when Grant arrived and knocked on the front door, she had looked at him for a moment in the doorway and said, "You drove 4 hours in a snowstorm." And he had said the road was clear by the last hour, and she had stepped back to let him in and made coffee, and they had sat at the kitchen table until midnight, talking about something that started as the trial and became something else entirely. It was not a smooth process. Celeste was not a smooth person to know. In the private sense, she was exacting and occasionally impatient, and she had opinions she held firmly, and she did not naturally yield on things she had decided were important. Grant was not easy, either, in his own way. He was quiet in ways that sometimes felt like withdrawal when it was actually just processing, and he carried the weight of his prior life in a manner that was neither dramatic nor fully resolved. And there were evenings when Piper asked him something simple, and something in his face went briefly somewhere complicated before it came back. They both knew what the other one cost. That was, Grant came to understand, not an obstacle. That was the actual basis for the thing 2 people who had looked at each other with clear enough eyes to see what was difficult and had kept showing up anyway. The conversation that changed the shape of things happened in March, on a Thursday evening, when Piper was at a sleepover, and Maya was doing homework in her room, and Celeste and Grant were in the kitchen after dinner, which had become a place where the real conversations happened for them, some gravitational quality of the kitchen table that neither of them had planned or particularly examined. Celeste was washing a pan with the focused attention she gave to things she was doing while thinking about something else, and Grant was drying what she'd already washed, which he had started doing automatically 2 months ago, and she said, without looking at him, "I used to think that being alone was just the price of having built something." He waited, like the 2 things were necessarily connected, that if you cared enough about the work to do it at the level I've done it, the other parts of your life got smaller. And I had decided I was okay with that. She handed him the pan. I wasn't sure I was okay with it, but I had decided. "What changed?" Grant said. "You didn't want anything from me." She turned to look at him. Everyone in my life at that level, every relationship that started from my professional position, the dynamic was always about what I could provide. Resources, access, connection, stability. Even the people who cared about me in their own ways, the relationship still had that as its foundation. She held his gaze. "You walked away from every version of that I offered. Payment, the job, the thank you for saving my daughter. You just kept showing up for the same reason every time." "What reason is that?" he said, though he knew. "Because you wanted to. Not because of what it would get you." She turned back to the sink. That turned out to matter more than I expected. Grant set the pan down. "For what it's worth," he said, "I was not in any way planning any of this." "I know. I was waiting for my daughter to finish an art class." "I know that too." A pause. "She's better at painting than Maya, by the way." "Maya will not acknowledge this." Piper started earlier. "Maya is very aware of this fact and does not find it comforting." Celeste turned off the water. Turned to face him fully. "I'm not good at asking for things I'm not sure I should want." "I know. I'm going to do it anyway." She held his gaze with the same steadiness she held everything, not without cost, but without flinching. "I want you in my life, not as a security consultant. Not as the man who happened to be on the right sidewalk. I want you here in the way that means you're part of this. She paused. Part of this house and these people and whatever this becomes. Grant looked at her for a moment. He thought about the sidewalk on Callaway Street. Cold coffee going colder. Two men in gray jackets and the way his attention had simply gone to them without being directed. The way it had always gone to the wrong thing in a crowd, because for a long time the wrong thing in a crowd was the most important thing to find. He thought about Piper telling Maya that her dad leaned against a lot of things, with the authority of an expert witness, and Maya looking at him and saying, "I noticed," and how that small exchange had somehow contained everything. He thought about what it meant to build a life after the life you thought you were going to have. How it never looked like what you imagined when you were younger and more certain about the shape of things. How it was always smaller in some ways and larger in others, and the largeness was always in places you hadn't thought to look. "Celeste," he said, "yes. I've been part of this for about 3 months. I think we're past the point where you need to ask." She held his gaze for one more second. Then something in her face did the thing it did, the window opening, and this it stayed open. They didn't mark the shift in any formal way. There was no dramatic moment with its clean edges. It was more like something that had been moving slowly finally arrived at a place it had been heading, and both of them recognized it without needing to announce it. The day Grant asked her to marry him was in August, a year and 2 months after a Tuesday afternoon in Bellhaven, when two men in gray jackets and a black SUV had miscalculated the contents of a Tuesday afternoon in Bellhaven. It was a Sunday, warm enough in the mountains to be outside, without jackets, and the four of them had driven out to a lake 40 minutes from the property, one of the high-altitude ones that stays cold regardless of the season. The kind of lake that was very blue and very still, and reflected the peaks around it with more clarity than the peaks themselves. Maya had brought a sketchbook. Piper had brought, for reasons she did not explain and was not asked to explain, a bag of bread for ducks that turned out to be inhabited by no ducks at all. Only a single ambitious goose that she fed the entire bag to while maintaining a negotiation with it about personal space. Grant and Celeste were sitting on a flat rock above the waterline. Not talking. They did that comfortably. Now silence between them had stopped being a thing that needed filling and had become its own form of being present. He had the ring in the pocket of his jacket. He had been carrying it there for 2 weeks, waiting for a moment that didn't feel engineered, because Celeste was the kind of person who would see through an engineered moment, and he didn't want to give her that. He wanted to give her the real version, which was just a day and a lake and their daughters, and the ordinary, improbable fact that they were here at all. He took it out. She was watching Maya sketch something on the far side of the rock, and she didn't see it immediately. And when she turned back and saw what was in his hand, she went very still. "I'm not going to make a speech," he said. "Good," she said. Her voice had gone quiet. "I'm not good at speeches." "I know. I'm good at showing up." He looked at her. "I'd like to keep showing up. For the rest of it. For you and Maya and the four of us and whatever comes next." He paused. "That's the whole thing. That's all I've got." Celeste looked at the ring and then looked at him, and her eyes were very bright in the mountain light. "Yes," she said, immediately. Without deliberating or calculating or running it through any of the filters she ran most things through, because some things bypassed all of that and arrived directly at the answer. Piper, who had been watching from 8 feet away with the goose, still at her feet, said yes in a volume that sent several birds from a nearby tree into immediate flight. Maya looked up from her sketchbook. She looked at her mother's face. She looked at Grant. She set the sketchbook down very deliberately on the rock beside her. Finally, she said, with the patient, long-suffering tone of a 12-year-old who had been privately certain of this outcome for several months and had not understood what was taking so long. Celeste laughed so hard she leaned against Grant's shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and Maya climbed up the rock and sat on her mother's other side, and Piper abandoned the goose entirely and came to sit beside Grant. And the four of them sat like that at the edge of a cold blue lake in the Colorado mountains, while the sun moved slowly across the peaks. It was not a perfect afternoon. The goose came back and investigated everyone's lunch. Piper got her shoes wet, crossing a stream she had been specifically told not to cross. Maya's sketch of the lake, when she showed it later, was technically impressive, But she had drawn the mountains slightly wrong, and she knew it, and was annoyed about it in a way she would not let go of until the drive home. Grant's knee ached from the cold rock. Celeste had forgotten the sunscreen and would find that out later. None of it was the way people described the best days of their lives in the retrospective telling, the smoothed-out version where everything took on a golden quality and the ordinary inconveniences got edited out. It was just the actual afternoon, with all its small frictions, and it was the best day Grant could remember in a long time. There is something that people who have been through genuinely frightening things sometimes discover on the other side of them, and it is this. The ordinary life you were living before the frightening thing happened was not as ordinary as it seemed. It was already the thing worth protecting. It was always the lake and the cold rock and the kid feeding bread to a goose and the person beside you who you hadn't yet understood you needed. The danger didn't create the value. It just made the value visible. Grant had known this, intellectually, for most of his adult life. He had built his life after the Navy around this understanding small house, honest work, one child he showed up for every day. He had thought he understood what he was protecting. What he hadn't understood was that protection wasn't a static condition. It wasn't a perimeter you established and maintained. It was a decision you kept making, every day, in the direction of the people and the things you'd decided mattered. The men who had stood outside a studio in Belhaven, in gray jackets with fake badges, had made their calculation, and it had seemed, from their vantage point, entirely sound. A child with a light security profile, a gap in the rotation, a driver who was alone, an operation with weeks of preparation behind it, and money and organization, and an inside source who knew all the angles. They had not calculated was the variable that cannot be planned for because it doesn't announce itself, and it doesn't follow a schedule, and it doesn't respond to threat or incentive in the ways that organized operations expect things to respond. They had not calculated the person who simply does the thing because it needs doing, with no other reason required. Grant had spent years thinking of that quality as something left over from a life he'd moved on from. A residue of training that had no real application in the life of a construction contractor waiting for his daughters outside an art class. He understood now that he'd had it wrong. The training hadn't given him that quality. It had only given him the tools to express it in specific circumstances. The quality itself was older than any of that, and simpler, and it was not going away. It was the thing Piper had seen in him from the beginning, in the way children saw the real version of people before the rest of the world got to them. It was the thing Maya had recognized on the floor of the studio when she was still shaking, and she'd looked at him and asked who he was, and he had said, just a father who happened to be here, and she had looked at him like that answer was both insufficient and somehow exactly right. It was the thing Celeste had trusted before she understood why she was trusting it. The afternoon at the lake ended, the way good afternoons ended gradually, reluctantly, with people taking longer than necessary to gather their things, because the gathering meant the leaving, and no one quite wanted to leave yet. Maya and Piper walked ahead on the trail back to the car, side by side, close enough that their shoulders touched, talking in the way they talked overlapping, shifting conversational rhythm of two people who had arrived at the specific comfort of a real friendship. Grant and Celeste walked behind them. He had her hand. She had his. The mountains in the late afternoon light were the color of things that had been there long enough to stop caring about being impressive and had simply become themselves. Trail wound back through the pines toward the parking area and the drive home and dinner and the ordinary Tuesday and Wednesday and Thursday that would follow this Sunday, with all their ordinary weight. He thought, this is the thing, not the crisis and the resolution, not the danger and the coming through it. This is the actual thing, the trail and the hand and the two kids ahead talking about something he couldn't quite hear. The most important victories in a person's life rarely look like victories from the inside. They look like a Sunday afternoon. They look like two girls with their shoulders touching on a mountain trail. They look like the simple, hard-won, unspectacular fact of having built something real, with people who chose to be real with you. Grant Maddox had once been trained for the most difficult conditions a person could be placed in. He had operated in places where the cost of inattention was permanent and the margin for error was zero. None of that had prepared him for this. Nothing could have. He held onto her hand and walked toward the car, and the mountains held their light a little longer the way they did in August. As if even the mountains understood that some afternoons were worth extending, and the trail wound forward through the pines toward whatever came next, which was ordinary and imperfect and entirely, completely enough.